Have you ever been interested in trying mind-altering psychedelics only to find out that they carry a Schedule 1 classification? Me too! And that's why today I'm going to persuade you guys that psychedelics absolutely should not be considered a Schedule 1 drug. Now, although psychedelics are significantly less harmful than their Schedule 1 classification would have most people believe, it is true that for people who are predisposed to mental illness, they should probably be avoided. I found a pretty knowledgeable book in the school's library with a really long title called How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. In the prologue of the book, the author, Michael Pollan, states that, quote, "When I began to weigh the potential benefits I was hearing against the risks, I was surprised to learn that psychedelics are far more frightening to people than they are dangerous. Many of the most notorious perils are either exaggerated or mythical," end quote. He goes on to state that, quote, "It is virtually impossible to die from a drug overdose of LSD or a psilocybin, and neither drug is addictive. I personally have done a lot of research on this topic and come across a lot of arguments as to why psychedelics have a legitimate and valuable nature that I believe can contribute positively to society. So I'd like to present some of that information right now. I know you may not think this is relevant to you. However, it has been speculated that the classification of psychedelics as a Schedule 1 drug has set back the evolution of human consciousness by several decades. And if the inhibition of our own consciousness isn't significant, I honestly don't know what is. So let's get in depth about a couple of things. First, we should cover a little bit of the history so we can understand why and how psychedelics became Schedule 1 drugs. Then we'll look at the penalties and why they don't make sense when considered alongside the possible benefits of psychedelic usage. And finally, we'll go over the benefits of psychedelic use versus the government's position. So let's get started. Psychedelics weren't always considered illegal substances. In fact, for a majority of human history, they played a major role in most societies, spiritually, religiously, and mentally. Unfortunately, during the Nixon administration, anti-war rhetoric from the free love movement during the 60s, and just plain racism against the black community emboldened Nixon to launch a war on drugs that directly targeted, quote, hippies and black people. The recreational use of psychedelics and marijuana ground to almost an immediate halt as a direct result of that. Before society even knew what hit them, they were bombarded with a smear campaign against psychedelics, marijuana, and understandably heroin. But, you know, in a CNN report written by Tom Lobianco called Report, Abe says Nixon's war on drugs targets hippies and black people. A quote was pulled directly from Harper's Bazaar interview with former Nixon domestic policy chief John Inrochman, and he stated the following, quote, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black people, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities," end quote. He goes on to say, quote, "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did," end quote. I think if you guys were to look into this topic independently, it would be pretty difficult to come to the conclusion that psychedelics are so harmful as to have the highest schedule classification for a controlled substance, let alone to have such harsh penalties for holding or distributing. One particular problem that came with the war on drugs during the Nixon administration is that, as I've pointed out, it disproportionately targets people of color. Not to mention that the health benefits of psychedelics are literally completely overlooked and ignored as a result of the Schedule 1 classification. We live in a society and in an era where anxiety and depression are far more frequently occurring than it has been in previous generations. In a Joe Rogan documentary, DMT, the spirit molecule, this statement is made by physician Leanna Standish. Quote, "I think the most important thing we could do right now that would be fairly straightforward to do is to ask the question of whether ayahuasca, a psychedelic tea containing DMT used in native religious ceremonies, could help people who have drug and alcohol abuse problems," end quote. She goes on to mention that many times people who are using drugs and alcohol are self-medicating a deep depression. So why is this relevant? Well, let's look at a scholarly article titled "Clinical Potential of Psilocybin as a Treatment for Mental Health Conditions," written by Jeremy Daniel and Margaret Haberman. This question is actually addressed, and the findings are very compelling and promising. Now, before heavy regulations were placed on LSD and other psychedelics, there was, quote, extensive research into the use of classic hallucinogens for alcohol dependency. This paper shows that the findings for groups that were administered psilocybin, a psychedelic mushroom that contains DMT compounds, showed patients all had a significant decrease in alcohol use post-psilocybin administration, end quote, even though I didn't start the quote. This study was performed over a period of several weeks. There were also results that proved the effectiveness of psychedelics in helping with anxiety disorders and other mental health issues. Unfortunately, science can't legally study psychedelics on a major scale despite the findings, and this is as a direct result of the Schedule 1 classification. According to a How Stuff Works article written by Shauna Freeman and Nathan Chandler, titled LSD Drug Laws Today, it is stated that, quote, the federal penalty for first offense of LSD possession is a maximum of 1 year in prison or a minimum fine of $1,000. The article goes on to state that, quote, even if it's a first-time offense, if the amount is up to 10 grams, the offender can spend up to 5 to 40 years in jail and face a fine of $2 million, end quote. And that's just for distributing. So obviously studying it is going to be virtually impossible, which is something that I believe should change. There is plenty of evidence to show that psychedelics, in comparison to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, is significantly less harmful and even has mental health benefits. This is in direct contrast with the narrative that has been pushed since the inception of an overtly racist and prejudiced war on drugs. An article called The Federal Drug Scheduling System Explained by German Lopez on Vox, I have to spell it out, provided me with some drug classifications along with some information to explain the why of it all. So here they is. Schedule 1, marijuana, heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and magic mushrooms. Schedule 2, cocaine, meth, oxy, Adderall, Ritalin, and Vicodin. The article goes on to explain that the distinction between Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances is whether the federal government thinks a drug has medical value. The DEA says Schedule 2 substances have some medical value, while Schedule 1 substances do not. But we already know, based on the information so generously provided to us by Nixon's own domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, that the classification of Schedule 1 drugs was specifically designed to disenfranchise and terrorize hippies and black people. How does it serve us to maintain a system that was clearly and inherently built upon racism and prejudice? We have to educate ourselves about this topic and really look into it and ask yourself if things add up. I don't think they do, and I believe that psychedelics shouldn't be considered a Schedule 1 drug. And if you do the research, I believe that you will agree with me. So now that we've gone over a brief history of psychedelics and how they got their classifications, the studies of psychedelics, mental health, and the benefits versus the government's position on psychedelics, let's all educate ourselves about this topic and do the right thing by giving psychedelics the consideration that I believe they deserve. Stay woke, fam.